Hi guys! So the second organ system that we're going to look at is the respiratory system. So by the end of this video, you should be able to answer the following questions, and you should take notes on these questions as we go along in the video. So first, what is the purpose of the respiratory system? Second, what are the structures of the respiratory system? Third, what are the function of those structures? And fourth, how does the respiratory system interact with the circulatory system? So all the systems, we're going to have interactions with each other. We want to be able to think about those. So first, before we start, I want you to think about why we respire. And respire basically means breathe. So think for a second, why do we breathe? And if you answered so we don't die, that's not enough. The reason that we respire is to get oxygen from the air into our bloodstream and to all the tissues and cells of our body so cellular respiration can occur. And so that oxygen is what we need to make ATP so the cells can do all their work. The air that we breathe is only like 20% oxygen. The rest of it is, most of it is nitrogen. There's also some carbon dioxide and some helium. So it actually takes some pretty specialized cells and tissues and organs to get the oxygen out of the air for us. And again, the respiratory system is closely related to the circulatory system because when we talk about getting the oxygen to all the parts of the body and all those cells, it's the circulatory system that brings it there. So here are the main structures of the circulatory system. I'm just going to trace the path for you, and then on the next slide we'll talk about their functions. So first off is, how does air get into our bodies? Either through our mouths or our nose, and that can be called the nasal passage. So air comes in our mouth and our nose and comes down this tube called the trachea. The trachea then branches off into two bronchi. That's that word. So the bronchi is just the trachea splitting off into two tubes. Each bronchi goes into one of the two lungs. So we have these two lungs. The lungs are the major organ of the respiratory system. And inside the lung, the bronchi branch out into these things called bronchioles. So they're just smaller tubes or smaller airways, and then the bronchioles end in these things called alveoli, and alveoli is where the magic is going to happen with oxygen and carbon dioxide. Then the last structure is the diaphragm, and that's down here, and that's a muscle actually that helps control our breathing. So let's look at this again and look at the functions of each of these things. So I just talked about the diaphragm last on the previous slide, but I'm going to talk about it first here because the diaphragm is what initiates breathing. It's this muscle, this smooth muscle that's down below our lungs, and when the diaphragm contracts, it creates this negative pressure that actually sucks air into our lungs. So the diaphragm is really important, and the diaphragm is an involuntary muscle, so it contracts on its own without us even having to think about it, which is nice. Having to think about breathing would be weird. Then the function of the mouth and the nose, nasal passage, is just the entryway for air. The function of that trachea is to lead from the entryway down into the lungs. The function of the bronchi is to branch out from that single tube into each lung. The function of the bronchioles is to get smaller and smaller airways because eventually we want to get to these tiny, tiny little alveoli. So we need to branch the bronchioles a whole bunch to get to all these tiny alveoli. Now the alveoli, these are kind of what you might call the functional unit of the lungs. So these, like I said before, that's where the magic happens. This is where the carbon dioxide is going to be dropped off from the blood and the oxygen is going to be picked up into the blood. And they're these tiny grape-like sacs. We'll look at a different picture that shows them in more detail. And that's where the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide happens. So here's a picture of alveoli. So like I said, they're kind of look like little grapes. There's tons and tons of them, almost 300 million, or around 300 million, in some cases even more, in each lung. So like 600 million total. And there's all these they're all, each alveoli is each alveolus, that's a singular, alveoli is the plural, but each one is a sphere, and what that does is it increases the surface area. So instead of just having like one big alveoli to alveolus to have oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse across, you get all this extra surface area by having a ton of them that are tiny, tiny, tiny. And the membranes of the alveoli are really thin, and that allows the oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse back and forth. So you can see here how blood vessels come right up to the alveoli and really wrap around them. And remember, the blue blood vessels are the ones without oxygen, leaving off their carbon dioxide, picking up oxygen, and then going back out into the bloodstream with that oxygen. And so the one structure that we didn't talk about a ton was the lung, and that's because the lung is all those things combined. The lung is comprised of all these alveoli and the bronchioles, and so it's like I've said before, the magic is happening at these alveoli, and together they make up the lung. So I want you to think again about these questions, please. What's the purpose of the respiratory system? The structures, their functions, and then how does the respiratory system interact with the circulatory system? And if you look back at that last slide again, where all those blood vessels come up to the alveoli, that should help you with that question. Have a wonderful night. See you tomorrow.